Okay, let's unpack this. Think about economic history for a moment. What comes to mind?
Well, probably the rhythm of booms and busts, right? Periods of rapid growth followed by painful downturns.
Exactly. That constant push and pull, that inherent volatility, it just feels like an unavoidable feature of market economies.
And yeah, for much of history, that's precisely what we saw.
But then something shifted. If you zero in on the United States, roughly from the mid-1980s all the way up to, say, 2007, the economy seemed, well, different. It entered a period known as the Great Moderation. Growth was smoother, recessions were, less frequent and less severe.
And crucially, volatility, the jaggedness of the lines on the charts for things like inflation and GDP, it dropped significantly.
Yeah, it was this period of unusual calm.
And for years, the economic world focused intensely on this recent period, trying to dissect why it happened.
Yeah.
Was it smarter policies? Was it fundamental changes in the economy's structure?
Or maybe just a lucky streak.
Right. Or just luck. But as we dove into the stack of sources you shared, spanning cutting-edge research from economic journals, analyses straight from central banks, and historical accounts, a fascinating twist emerged.
Which was?
The modern Great Moderation wasn't the first time America experienced such a prolonged era of economic stability.
Really?
Yeah. There was another one generations earlier, driven by entirely different forces.
Okay, that's where it gets really interesting. It challenges the easy assumptions about what causes stability, doesn't it?
It really does.
So our mission in this deep dive is to first really understand the modern Great Moderation. What were its hallmarks? What made it so different from what came before?
And what are the leading theories, the structural changes, the good luck, the policy shifts that economists have debated for years as the potential culprits?
Exactly. And then we're going to step back in time, uncover this first Great Moderation, see what the sources say that was all about, and ultimately compare the two.
What can these two distinct episodes of calm, separated by over a century and seemingly powered by totally different engines, teach us about the fundamental forces shaping the economy's roller coaster ride?
It's like sifting through historical and statistical evidence to solve a complex puzzle.
It really is. We have different researchers presenting different pieces of the puzzle, sometimes emphasizing one factor over others.
Our job is to look at the whole picture presented in the sources and see what the most compelling arguments are and, importantly, where the disagreements lie.
Exactly. Think of the sources as our raw data, the historical records, the econometric studies, the expert opinions.
We're here to be your guides, highlighting the key findings and, connecting the dots.
So let's begin with a period that most economists immediately think of, the modern Great Moderation. As we noted, it really took hold in the mid-1980s.
Right, building on the back of the disinflationary efforts of the late 70s and early 80s.
And it lasted until the financial storms gathered in 2007. The defining characteristic, repeatedly emphasized in the sources, was that dramatic drop in macroeconomic volatility.
And it wasn't just a small dip, was it? We're talking about a fundamental shift in the amplitude of economic cycles.
Absolutely. The swings in GDP growth, for example, became significantly smaller.
And recessions, when they did occur, like the early 1990s or the early 2000s downturns, were notably milder and shorter than the severe slumps of the 1970s or earlier post-war periods.
That's right. And coupled with that was the remarkable stability in inflation. After the double-digit inflation of the 1970s and early 80s, inflation settled down to a much lower, more predictable rate.
So this dual stability, low volatility in both output and inflation, that's the core of the Great Moderation.
That's it.
And the benefits cited in the sources are pretty clear. For businesses, more predictable inflation and smoother demand make planning easier.
Right. You're less likely to be caught off guard by sudden drops in sales or unexpected spikes in costs.
And for households, stable inflation means the purchasing power of your savings is more secure, and you can plan future expenses with more confidence.
Precisely. Reduced uncertainty in both the general price level and the overall pace of economic activity makes investment less risky and helps households make better long-term decisions about saving and spending.
It was seen, at the time, as a triumph of sorts, an economy that was not only growing but doing so with less of the painful instability that had plagued previous decades.
And as you pointed out, this wasn't just an American phenomenon. Many other developed economies experienced a similar reduction in volatility during this same roughly 2-decade span.
So you have this extended stretch of economic calm,
Yeah.
stretching from the Reagan years through Clinton and most of the George W. Bush administration. Naturally, economists went into overdrive trying to figure out the magic formula.
Yeah, they did. And the sources lay out the main suspects, usually grouped into those three camps we mentioned.
Which came largely from analyses done during or just after the period, right? Like Bernanke's 2004 speech, which pops up a lot in the material.
Exactly. The debate revolves around which factor or combination of factors was primarily responsible.
Okay, camp number one, the structural change argument. The idea here is that the fundamental wiring of the U.S. economy changed in a way that made it inherently less prone to large swings.
Right. It wasn't just external conditions or policy. The economy itself became more stable.
And the sources supporting this point to several specific transformations. What's a big one?
A significant one is the shift in economic activity away from manufacturing and towards services.
Oh, okay.
Manufacturing, with its reliance on large physical inventories and capital investment cycles, tends to be more sensitive to changes in demand. A small drop in sales can lead to a large reduction in production as companies clear stockpiles.
I can see that. If demand for cars dips, factories might shut down temporarily.
Exactly, whereas services, often involve less physical inventory and may be less susceptible to these sharp swings. If demand for consulting services dips, consultants might just have fewer projects, but the core infrastructure and workforce don't shut down in the same abrupt way.
Makes sense. Less lumpy, maybe.
Sort of. And related to that is the argument about improved inventory management.
Okay, how so?
Advances in information technology, things like just-in-time systems, allowed companies to track and manage their inventories much more precisely.
Right, better data, faster response.
Which reduced the need for large buffer stocks and, consequently, lessened the severity of the inventory cycle, a major driver of past recessions where businesses drastically cut orders after finding themselves with too much stock during a slowdown.
So technology making supply chains leaner and more responsive, smoothing out that particular source of volatility.
Got it. Right. Other structural changes cited include innovations in financial markets.
How do they supposedly help?
Well, the argument is that deeper, more sophisticated financial markets allowed businesses and households to better manage risk and smooth their spending and investment over time.
Like easier access to credit for households to smooth consumption, even if income fluctuates.
Exactly that. Or companies being able to use financial instruments to hedge against various risks. Increased openness to trade and capital flows and deregulation in various industries are also mentioned as making the economy more flexible and potentially better able to absorb shocks.
Okay, so structural changes. Services, IT-driven inventory management, financial market depth, maybe deregulation and globalization. That's one big potential explanation. What about Camp 2?
Camp 2 is often framed quite simply: good luck.
Just luck.
Pretty much. This view argues that the economy wasn't necessarily more stable intrinsically, but it simply wasn't hit by the same intensity or frequency of large, disruptive shocks that characterized earlier periods.
So fewer major crises originating from outside the standard economic cycle.
Right.
Like fewer oil shocks or things like that.
Precisely. Supporters of this view, like the research by Stock and Watson mentioned in the sources, looked at historical data and concluded that the variance of the underlying economic shocks hitting the economy was just much higher in the 1970s compared to the post-1984 period.
So the inputs were calmer.
That's the idea. Think of the massive oil price shocks of the 70s. If the economy of the 1970s had faced the milder shocks of the Great Moderation period, it might have been less volatile.
And conversely, if the post-1984 economy had been hit by the turbulent shocks of the 70s, it might not have seemed so great.
Exactly. Less turbulent inputs led to less turbulent outputs, regardless of how the economic engine was built or tuned. It's a compellingly simple explanation.
Okay. And then the third camp, often favored by policymakers themselves, improved macroeconomic policy.
Yes, this perspective places the credit squarely on better conducted monetary policy, primarily by the Federal Reserve.
Especially under the leadership of Paul Volcker, who tamed inflation, and his successors Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke.
Right. The core idea here, as outlined in sources like Bernanke's speech, is that previous policy, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, was, let's say, particularly inefficient.
Inefficient how?
Well, maybe policymakers didn't fully understand the dynamics of inflation and unemployment, or perhaps they misjudged the impact of their actions.
Leading to policy choices that inadvertently made the economy more volatile.
That's the argument, pushing it away from the best possible trade-off between output and inflation volatility. The metaphor often used is that improved policy allowed the economy to move closer to or onto the efficient frontier.
The theoretical boundary representing the best combination of output and inflation volatility achievable.
Exactly. They weren't just lucky, they were better at their job, making decisions that actively fostered stability.
Okay, so what was the specific mechanism of this improved policy, according to this view? How do they supposedly get better?
A major focus is on how the Federal Reserve responded to inflation. Analyses using simple models like the Taylor rule, which approximates how central banks set interest rates based on inflation and the output gap.
Right, I've heard of that.
They found that the estimated response of policy to inflation strengthened significantly, starting around 1979 or 1980.
Strengthened, meaning they hiked rates more aggressively when inflation rose.
Yes, and specifically, they started adhering more consistently to what's called the Taylor principle.
The Taylor principle. Okay, what's that?
It's a crucial concept in monetary policy. The principle states that to effectively control inflation and stabilize the economy, the central bank must raise its nominal policy interest rate by more than 1 percentage point for every 1 percentage point increase in inflation.
Okay, break that down a bit. Why more than 1 for 1? That sounds aggressive.
Because the real cost of borrowing the nominal interest rate minus inflation is what really matters for economic decisions.
Ah, the real interest rate. Got it.
If the nominal interest rate only rises by the same amount as inflation or less, the real interest rate either stays the same or it actually falls.
Which would stimulate spending, right? Potentially making inflation worse.
Exactly. A lower or unchanged real interest rate stimulates spending. But if the nominal rate rises by more than inflation, the real interest rate increases.
Yeah.
A higher real interest rate makes borrowing more expensive, encourages saving, and slows down the economy, helping to bring inflation back under control.
So if you don't follow the Taylor principle, you might actually be pouring gasoline on the inflation fire.
Essentially, yes. Sources suggest that in the 1970s, monetary policy may have sometimes violated this principle, allowing real interest rates to fall or even become negative when inflation rose, which likely contributed to the instability.
And then Volcker came in.
After Volcker took the reins, policy became much more aggressive in raising rates by more than inflation, firmly establishing positive real interest rates when needed. This credible commitment to fighting inflation helped anchor inflation expectations.
And anchoring expectations is key.
Absolutely. In this view, that was key to achieving both lower inflation and greater output stability. It reduced the risk of destabilizing feedback loops, where rising inflation expectations fuel actual inflation, requiring ever larger policy interventions.
So smarter policy, specifically a more rigorous approach to raising rates above the rate of inflation when needed, was the core driver, according to this camp.
That's the central theme. But some research digs even deeper into the policy mechanism. The Mojon paper you included, for instance, uses more advanced statistical models to look at the sources of volatility in different parts of the economy.
And that paper found something interesting about monetary policy shocks, didn't it? Not just the rule, but the unexpected stuff.
Yes, exactly. It highlights that beyond just the systematic rule of how policy responds to data, like the Taylor rule, there's also an element of unpredictable policy actions shocks.
Okay.
Using a Markov switching VAR model, which allows for the economy's behavior to shift between different regimes, like high or low volatility, Mojon found evidence that a significant factor in the 1970s and early 80s was a high volatility regime, partly driven by large monetary policy shocks.
The Fed itself was maybe more erratic back then.
Or at least the impact of their unexpected actions was larger or more frequent. The reduction in the size of these unpredictable policy actions after the early 80s appears to have played a crucial role, according to this research.
So the Fed became not just more systematic, but also more predictable. Less random noise from monetary policy itself.
That's one interpretation of the findings. And Mojon's research makes an interesting link between this and the behavior of specific components of demand, like household investment in durable goods and housing.
What did he find there?
He found that during the Great Moderation, household investment became less correlated or decoupled from the overall business cycle compared to earlier periods.
Decoupled, meaning households weren't cutting back on cars and houses as much during mild slowdowns.
Right. Even if the overall economy dipped a bit, household investment held up better than it used to.
And why might that be?
Well, he suggests this decoupling might be related to changes in household financing. Easier access to mortgages, maybe lower down payment requirements, the ability to refinance mortgages to extract cash.
Home equity loans and things like that.
Exactly. That could have allowed households to smooth their spending plans better, even if their income was temporarily affected by economic fluctuations.
Okay, and here's where it gets really complex.
Yeah.
How does that link back to policy?
Well, this is the tricky part. A stable, low inflation environment fostered by better monetary policy might have actually encouraged these structural changes in financial markets and household behavior.
Wow. So it could be that better policy didn't just respond to the economy differently, but it created an environment where the economy itself started behaving differently.
Precisely.
That circles back to Bernanke's point about the Lucas critique, doesn't it?
Exactly. The Lucas critique, a foundational idea in macroeconomics, suggests that the observed relationships in the economy can change when the policy regime changes.
Because people adapt their behavior to the new rules of the game.
Right. If the central bank credibly commits to low inflation, it can change how businesses and households set wages and prices, how they form expectations, even how they manage their finances. Bernanke uses the term rational inattention.
Rational inattention.
Yeah, the idea is if inflation is volatile, you have to pay close attention to every price change. It takes effort. But if inflation is stable and low, you can afford to be less attentive, maybe update your prices or wage demands less frequently.
Which in turn could contribute to overall economic stability, smoother adjustments.
That's the potential feedback loop. So the policy story isn't just they did Taylor rule better. It could be that policy created the conditions that fostered some of the very structural changes like financial innovation or different pricing behavior that are listed in Camp 1.
Okay, my head is spinning slightly. It makes teasing apart the causes incredibly difficult. Policy affects structure, structure affects shocks, shocks affect policy.
And that leads us right to the heart of the great debate acknowledged in the sources. Despite decades of research, there's no single, universally accepted answer to why the Great Moderation happened.
The evidence is conflicting, and different studies using different methods come to different conclusions.
You see this clearly summarized in places like Table 1 in the ECB source you shared. Some studies conclude that the reduction in volatility was primarily due to smaller shocks hitting the economy, Camp 2. Good luck.
Right.
Others conclude it was primarily due to changes in the propagation mechanism, how shocks affect the economy, which includes both structural changes and the effects of systematic policy. So, Camp 1 and Camp 3 arguably intertwined.
And one reason this is so hard to pin down is the methodological challenge, right? How do you definitively distinguish a smaller external shock from a change in the economy's sensitivity to that shock?
Exactly. Many econometric models rely on assumptions that might not hold, potentially leading them to misattribute the source of stability. For example, as one source discusses, if the underlying economic processes were behaving in complex, nonlinear ways in the past,
Like in the turbulent 70s.
simpler linear models might interpret that complexity as just higher shock variance, when the true shocks weren't necessarily larger, but the economy's reaction was different or just harder to capture with those simpler tools.
So maybe the 1970s didn't have inherently bigger shocks, but the economy at the time reacted to them in a more volatile, complex way that simple models can't fully untangle.
That's the kind of issue researchers grapple with. And that brings us to some of the newer methodological approaches trying to overcome these challenges, like the indirect inference method discussed in the Cardiff paper.
Indirect inference. Okay, what's the idea there?
Instead of just estimating pieces of a model, indirect inference tests whether an entire structural model, including its assumptions about policy rules, how agents behave, how shocks propagate, can actually reproduce key statistical features of the real-world data.
Like the patterns of volatility and co-movement observed across different economic variables.
Exactly. You essentially build a complete theoretical economy in a computer, put in your hypothesized policy rule or structural features, simulate data from it, and then see if the simulated data looks statistically similar to the actual historical data.
So you search for the parameters in your theoretical model that make the simulated data look as much like the real data as possible.
That's the core idea. The Cardiff paper used this to test different monetary policy rules against the observed data, specifically comparing a standard Taylor rule against something called an optimal timeless rule.
And what did their simulation-based testing reveal? This sounds like a powerful technique.
Their findings were quite surprising, actually, especially in the context of the conventional debate we just outlined. They found that structural models incorporating a standard Taylor rule, even allowing for variations like interest rate smoothing, were strongly rejected by the data for both the pre- and post-1982 periods.
Rejected. Wow. Meaning a simulated economy following a standard Taylor rule didn't look statistically like the actual U.S. economy in terms of its key volatility characteristics.
That's what their results suggest, based on this specific methodology. So the idea that the Great Moderation was simply due to the Fed following a standard Taylor rule more aggressively, that doesn't hold up according to this test.
Okay, so what did fit the data better?
They found that a model based on an optimal timeless rule fit the data much better, particularly after they estimated the model's parameters to best match the observed dynamics.
An optimal timeless rule. What's the intuition behind that? Sounds quite different.
It's a rule derived from thinking about what a central bank would do if it wanted to achieve the best possible outcomes for inflation and output stability over the long term without trying to exploit temporary trade-offs.
Or forward-looking, perhaps.
In a sense. The version they tested is often associated with a policy where the central bank sets its interest rate such that the change in the rate responds to inflation and the output gap. This implies a very strong commitment to stabilizing inflation over the long run, kind of an infinitely strong response to persistent inflation deviations.
Okay, so maybe the rule being followed wasn't the simple Taylor rule we often analyze, but something more complex, maybe even more theoretically grounded, like this optimal timeless rule.
That's one interpretation you could draw from their results, and the fact that this rule fit the data better, combined with their analysis of shock variances within that model, led them to conclude that a fall in the variance of the structural shocks hitting the economy was likely the main driver of the observed stability.
Oh.
Not necessarily a fundamental shift in the systematic policy rule itself.
So this advanced methodology, at least in this study, leans more towards the good luck explanation, or at least suggests the stability wasn't primarily about adopting a different, simple, systematic rule like the standard Taylor rule.
That's the implication from this specific research, yes. It suggests that maybe what appeared to be a change in the policy rule in simpler models, like that stronger Taylor coefficient, might have been a bit of an illusion or misspecification stemming from not fully capturing the complexity of the economy or the true policy objective.
Interesting.
They even suggest that what looks like interest rate smoothing in simple models might just be a side effect of trying to fit those simple models to data that were actually generated by a different process entirely. Perhaps one where the shocks themselves became less volatile and the optimal timeless rule doesn't inherently require smoothing to fit.
This really underscores how challenging it is to definitively say A caused B in economics, especially when multiple factors were changing simultaneously. Different tools, different assumptions, they can give you different answers.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing area of research, and these newer methods are just one way researchers are trying to get a clearer picture. It's far from a closed book.
Okay, we've deep dived into the modern Great Moderation and the heated debate over its causes. Now, let's make that jump back in time, because incredibly, there's research pointing to another period where the U.S. economy seemed to achieve a similar state of stable growth.
But in a world utterly different from the one we just discussed.
Exactly.
Yes, the paper identifying America's first Great Moderation points to a remarkable 16-year span between 1841 and 1856.
1841 to 1856. Wow. We're talking pre-Civil War, a time before anything resembling a central bank, before modern statistics, before industrialization as we fully understand it today was complete. How could there possibly be a Great Moderation then?
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Yet the data presented in the source are compelling. They document a sustained economic expansion during these years with a striking absence of significant downturn.
Really? No big recessions for 16 years back then?
Apparently not major ones. Economic growth rates were high, particularly in areas crucial for the economy's expansion at the time. Industrial production, for example, grew at an average rate of nearly 8% per year during this period.
8%.
Compared to a typical 5% in surrounding decades between 1792 and 1914. And critically, just like the modern period, volatility in key economic indicators, including financial markets and labor markets, was significantly lower than in adjacent eras.
So not just growth, but stable high growth. That's the holy grail.
Right.
What did the sources pinpoint as the drivers of this earlier period of calm, what was going on in the 1840s and 50s?
Well, this stability is linked to some really fundamental transformations happening in the U.S. economy in the mid-19th century. You had rapid population growth, fueled by high birth rates and significant immigration.
Right, Ed, we're coming in.
Doubling the labor force and tripling the urban population between 1840 and 1860.
Right.
This demographic boom expanded markets and increased the potential for aggregate production, which the researchers suggest likely contributed to reducing the probability of recession.
More demand, more workers.
Yeah. Westward expansion and land sales also played a role, leading to widespread development of new farmland and, crucially, the necessary transportation links to connect it to markets. Financial and labor markets were also becoming more integrated across the rapidly expanding nation.
Okay, those are big macro-level shifts. But the source really hones in on one specific, tangible revolution as the primary engine of this stability, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They highlight the central role of what economic historians call the transportation revolution of this era, building on the work of George R. Taylor.
The transportation revolution.
This period saw immense investment and rapid productivity gains in transportation infrastructure, roads, canals, but above all, railroads and global shipping.
And the examples provided are just incredible in their scale, like the shipbuilding boom you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the sources detail how American shipyards built more merchant tonnage in the 1840s and 50s than they had in the previous 4 decades combined.
4 decades. Incredible.
The peak in 1854-55 was astonishingly high, a level not surpassed until the demands of World War I. Shipbuilding was a massive industry at the time, representing over 5% of the value added in the entire industrial sector.
Huge. And within that, the era of the clipper ship stands out. Sounds romantic, but it was serious business.
Oh, absolutely. The clipper ship era, specifically from the late 1840s to the mid-1850s, these were not just ships. They were marvels of engineering for their time, incredibly fast, designed to cut through the water with increased cargo capacity.
And their profitability was immense, right? Fueled by specific trades.
Immense, fueled by specific, high-value, time-sensitive trades. Think of the California gold rush. Suddenly, you had a booming population on the West Coast needing goods, and clipper ships were the fastest way to get them there from the East Coast or Europe.
Made fortunes, I bet.
And the China tea trade was another key driver, getting the first tea shipments of the season fetched premium prices. The source mentions the staggering profitability. A single round trip from the East Coast to San Francisco could generate a profit equal to the ship's entire construction cost.
Wow. Which was significant in itself.
Oh, yes, potentially over $3 million in today's dollars for a large one.
Yeah.
That level of profitability would certainly fuel massive investment and activity in the industry.
And it had spillover effects too, right? Like on timber.
Exactly. The demand for wood to build these ships was so high, it reportedly led to the exhaustion of coastal timber fields in the 1850s. It wasn't just shipbuilding. It drove demand for related industries.
So a whole ecosystem built around these ships.
Right. And while clipper ships peaked and began to decline around 1857 as steamships became more competitive, the growth in steamships, particularly in the Atlantic trade, was also significant during this period.
And complementing the maritime revolution was the explosion of railroads on land.
Yes, railroad mileage had been expanding through the 1830s and 40s, starting to rival canals. But the 1850s saw a truly massive construction boom. Almost 22,000 miles of track were laid in that single decade.
22,000 miles in 10 years.
Yeah. By the eve of the Civil War, railroads had firmly established themselves as the dominant means of transportation across much of the country.
So this period of stability coincided with a monumental, visible, tangible transformation of the economy's ability to move goods, people, and information. It wasn't abstract like financial derivatives. It was iron rails, wooden ships, and steam engines connecting markets and opening up new territories.
That's a great way to put it. And the research provides statistical evidence that this transportation investment wasn't just happening during the moderation. It appears to have been a primary source driving it.
How do they show that statistically?
Using methods like Markov regime switching, they show that the estimated period of low volatility was much weaker, less statistically significant, or less pronounced when investment in transportation goods was excluded from the analysis.
Interesting. So if you take transportation out of the picture, the economy doesn't look nearly as stable during those 16 years.
Correct. And even more compellingly, they use Granger causality tests.
Which look for whether one time series helps predict another.
Exactly. They show that during this 1841-1856 period, transportation industrial production led overall industrial production and even consumption goods output at high levels of statistical significance.
Meaning changes in transportation investment happen before changes in overall output.
That's the implication. This leading relationship where transportation seemed to be pulling other sectors along was unique to this era and didn't hold in the post-Civil War period. Other factors people might think of, like the cotton crop, tariffs, or even British industrial output, didn't show the same consistent leading relationship with U.S. industrial growth during this specific time.
That's strong evidence suggesting that the boom in investment in transportation were not just coincident with stability, but were actually driving it. It paints a picture of a stability born from expanding markets, increased efficiency through better transport, and the sheer scale of productive investment in a critical sector.
That's the conclusion the research points to. It was a stability rooted in a physical, technological transformation that integrated the national economy more tightly and efficiently than ever before.
So we have these two distinct periods labeled Great Moderation, one from the mid-19th century, the other from the late 20th and early 21st. They both represent extended stretches of unusually low economic volatility compared to the times around them.
Right, that's the common thread, low volatility.
But based on the sources, the story of why they happened seems remarkably different.
Yes, they both involve significant investment and structural change, that's true. In the first, it was clearly about investment in physical transportation infrastructure and capital goods, integrating markets geographically.
Very tangible.
In the modern period, there was investment in IT, sure. But the structural change arguments also lean heavily on shifts towards services, financial market developments, and potentially changes in household behavior fostered by the economic environment, much less physical.
And the causes debated for the modern period are much more abstract and interconnected. Is it policy? Is it inherent structural shifts? Is it luck? The sources show there's still no consensus. We just went through that whole debate.
Whereas the first moderation seems much more directly tied to a specific, measurable, tangible technological and investment boom, the transportation revolution, the evidence seems clearer, or at least less contested in the sources we looked at.
That seems to be the key contrast. One driven by steel rails and clipper ships connecting a vast continent. The other potentially by sophisticated financial instruments, information technology, and the nuanced application of monetary policy, possibly coupled with a break from disruptive external events.
The nature of the stability engine appears fundamentally different across the two periods.
And that brings us, unfortunately, to the end of the modern story, which, unlike the peaceful conclusion of the antebellum expansion before the Civil War, came to a rather crashing halt.
Indeed. The Great Moderation ended abruptly and painfully with the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 and the subsequent Great Recession.
Which, understandably, led many to question whether the Great Moderation was ever truly robust, or perhaps even a misleading term altogether. Was it just the calm before the storm?
And some, like Bill Mitchell in one of the sources, are much more critical, arguing that the Great Moderation wasn't real stability at all, calling it a myth.
A myth. That's a strong claim. What's his argument?
He directly challenges the conventional narrative we discussed earlier. For instance, he disputes the idea that the increased depth and sophistication of financial markets, often cited as a positive structural change, were actually stabilizing factors.
He's pretty blunt about it, isn't he? I recall reading him calling financial markets largely parasitic.
That's his perspective laid out in the source, yes. He argues that deregulation allowed them to operate outside any genuine public purpose, instead feeding greed. He sees this deregulation and financial complexity as shorthand for instruments and practices that drained resources from the real economy.
Okay.
And, crucially, helped fuel the massive increase in household and firm debt leading up to the crisis.
So he links the supposed benefits directly to the eventual crash.
Directly. He challenges the idea that growing asset wealth somehow justified this debt accumulation, pointing out the obvious risk that asset values could collapse, which they did, leaving the fixed nominal value debt-crushing households and businesses. He notes this was exacerbated in some cases by foreign currency debt.
So from his viewpoint, the period wasn't stable at all. It was actually building up massive, unsustainable imbalances, particularly in the financial sector and through debt accumulation, which eventually had to unwind catastrophically.
Yes, he sees the very factors often credited for the stability, especially financial innovation and deregulation, as the drivers of the subsequent crisis. He also expresses skepticism about the importance attributed to improved monetary policy as the primary source of the calm.
And he links monetary policy itself, specifically an inflation-first approach, like inflation targeting, to negative outcomes even during the supposedly stable period, right?
That's correct. He argues that despite official unemployment figures falling during that time, this policy approach led to persistently high labor underutilization.
Meaning, many people were still struggling to find sufficient work or hours, even if the headline unemployment rate looked okay.
Exactly. People underemployed, discouraged workers, etc. He also contends that the focus on low inflation, while achieved, came at a higher cost than necessary in terms of output loss, pointing to higher sacrifice ratios in the 1990s compared to earlier decades.
Sacrifice ratio, that's the economic output you have to give up the amount of GDP lost for every 1 percentage point reduction in inflation.
Precisely. He argues that the flatter relationship between inflation and unemployment that emerged during the moderation, sometimes called a flatter Phillips curve, actually made it more costly in terms of lost output and jobs to bring inflation down further or keep it low.
So achieving that low inflation might have had hidden costs in the labor market.
That's his argument. And he attributes the failure to fully eliminate labor underutilization, even with low inflation, partly to an accompanying ideology of fiscal passivity, a reluctance by governments to use spending and taxation actively to support employment and aggregate demand, leaving too much burden on monetary policy.
So Mitchell's critique offers a fundamentally different narrative. The Great Moderation wasn't a period of stable success driven by good policy or beneficial structural change. It was a period where risky financial imbalances were allowed to build, enabled by deregulation, maybe exacerbated by monetary policy choices focused too narrowly on inflation, and a lack of fiscal support for the real economy, ultimately leading to an inevitable crisis.
It's a starkly critical perspective, challenging the entire notion of a stable period and highlighting the potential negative consequences lurking beneath the surface calm. The fact that the period ended so dramatically certainly gives weight to the idea that underlying fragilities existed, whatever their cause.
This deep dive has really taken us through two fascinating yet vastly different periods of unusual economic stability in the U.S. We had the modern Great Moderation, a recent phenomenon with its causes intensely debated among policy improvements, structural shifts, and sheer luck, ending abruptly in a global crisis.
And then America's first Great Moderation, a 19th century episode seemingly driven much more clearly by a tangible, monumental revolution in transportation and physical investment, connecting the country and boosting productivity.
It leaves you with profound questions, doesn't it, about what truly drives economic stability. Is it the sophisticated, sometimes abstract levers of modern policy and finance? Is it the organic evolution of the economy's structure?
Or is sustained calm perhaps more likely when rooted in tangible, productive investments that expand the economy's physical capacity and efficiency, like building out transportation networks was back then?
Yeah, considering the painful crash that followed the modern period and contrasting it with the earlier stability fueled by iron, wood, and steam, well, one has to wonder if there's something fundamental about the type of economic transformation that fosters robust, lasting stability.
Are we potentially missing something crucial in focusing so much on the abstract financial and policy realm if we overlook the foundational importance of investment in the real physical economy?
It's definitely a question worth pondering as you look at the economic landscape today.